Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. I love a road trip story, a novel that takes you on a physical journey as much as an emotional one, where the characters are changed by their days on the road and emerge at the end of the trip different from the characters who set out. Sasha Wasley's brand new novel, A Caravan Like a Canary, published by Pantera Press, is exactly this kind of story. A beautifully written, heartfelt tale about a family ripped apart by tragedy and the road trip taken by siblings Tara and Zac Button in an attempt to put the past to rest and heal old wounds. Set against the stunning WA coastline, this is a gorgeous novel that had me enthralled from start to finish. And I'm super excited that Sasha's joining me from WA today to chat about this wonderful novel. Welcome to the podcast, Sasha.
Thank you so much, Claudine. It's awesome to be on Talking Aussie Books.
It's such a delight for me to have you. And I wanted to say congratulations on the release of A Caravan Like a Canary. Such a rich, heart-wrenching story layered with complex themes and a cast of super interesting characters. So where did the inspiration for this novel initially come from?
Well, okay, it's a bit random, but this is kind of how my ideas happen. I was just driving along the road near my home one day and I noticed a bright red caravan, like a vintage one. And it was painted to look like a ladybug with eyes and dots and things like that. And I just noticed it and thought it was cute. And then every time I drove past it, I looked at it. And then eventually I started to think, I wonder what that caravan has seen in its lifetime. You know, it looks a bit battered. It's obviously been around for quite a few decades. And then I started to sort of think about things that it might have seen, and I ended up coming up with a bit of a story. And at that time, I had been wanting to get my teeth into something with a bit of grittiness, I suppose. I'd been writing a children's book, which I write under a pen name. And I sort of felt like I really needed to go to the dark side a little bit in terms of content. So it just gelled nicely. It was like a dovetail moment. I had this caravan. I wanted to write something where something unpleasant or painful had happened in a childhood. And the two things came together.
It certainly has explored the dark side in many respects. So did the end product, do you think, resemble what you initially set out to write, or did it take on a life of its own once you started?
My books always take on the life of their own, but it did kind of resemble. I didn't always know where the story was going, and there was quite a bit of stuff added in after I wrote the first draft to make it all gel a bit better and to tie, just to put some continuity into it, tie the healing journey together with what happened when they were younger, but also tie together Zac's journey in particular. That needed a bit of work. Yeah, because, everyone in the caravan goes on a journey, on their own sort of journey in this book. And so I just needed to make sure they all came together, and they were kind of entwined.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, Sasha, for readers who haven't got their hands on this gorgeous book yet, can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, sure. So A Caravan Like a Canary is the story about Tara Button, who is in her early 30s, and her brother Zac. When they were kids, their mum suddenly decided she was going to take them on a road trip, and she managed to get hold of a bright yellow caravan, hence the title of the book, and loaded them up and took them on this trip up the WA coast. Now, they didn't understand at the time there were actually some things that mum was running away from. And on that journey, they started to become more aware of what was happening with mum and dad, and they saw some things that they didn't really understand or be able to make sense of at the age they were at 11 and 8 years old. And then the trip kind of ended in disaster, and now what we have is a situation nearly 20 years later where Tara's mum is living up in a town called Elsewhere, and she hasn't got very long to live. And she rings Tara and she says, I need you to bring the old yellow caravan up to Elsewhere for me. And at first Tara's very reluctant, but Zac talks her into it because Zac can talk her into pretty much anything. They have that kind of dynamic. And then Zac gets his mate Dan to tag along, and they embark on the same road trip. Now, I guess the trick is that when you're older, you start to see things through different eyes. So they actually meet some of the people that they met first time round, and there are things that start to come a little bit unravelled, and truths that they realise and secrets that become uncovered. And so it's kind of, it's a healing journey, because Tara, although she's got her life together, she's still very much in a kind of post-traumatic mindset. And Zac's got his own issues. So it becomes not only a healing journey, but also a chase. and there are some bikies that come into it, but I don't want to give away too much. So I'll leave it there.
Absolutely fantastic. Now, at first, Tara seems like quite an insular character. She's very tight-lipped about her past, and she keeps mostly to herself. She stays in her lane and she's going through the motions, so to speak. Such a marked contrast to her brother Zac. She's not really that person, though, is she? She's been shaped by the tragedy of her past, and Zac too. But I feel like Tara is more damaged. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think Tara took on some of the burden of responsibility when she was a kid, and certainly then after that, when Mum became unavailable after the Caravan events of their childhood, and they were pretty much raised by Nan, who is another important character. But Tara kind of worked out at that point that she had to look after Zac, and Zac was going completely off the rails, so it wasn't an easy task. So for her, I guess her needs always came second to Zac's all through those teenage years. And right into adulthood, he's still now messing up, and she's still trying to clean up the messes. But yeah, she kind of turned inward, worked out how to get her own life on track so that she could focus on her brother, whereas he kind of turned outward and everything, and acted out everything that he'd been through, just through, use of drugs and getting into trouble and things that she had to run around trying to patch up after him. Sometimes I wonder if it is that older sibling thing. You just have that sense of responsibility. I'm not the eldest in my family, but I am an older sibling. So I do understand that sense of unconditional love for a younger sibling, and the sense that you'll do anything for them and you have to look after them. And I'm sure that my older sister felt that about me. She loves telling the story where I nearly stepped on a snake one day when we were walking to school, and she was able to grab me and drag me off the footpath and save me just in time. And, I think all older siblings have that sense of, whether or not the parents say to them, look after your little brother or whatever, it's just a sense that you need to look after them. They're littler than you.
I absolutely felt that sense of responsibility heavily on Tara's shoulders throughout the novel. Domestic or family violence is a theme that's finding its way into more and more Australian stories, and I've talked about the national shame that is the statistical incidence of family violence in this country before in this podcast. Though it's not the main theme of this novel, it underpins Tara's backstory, and it explains a lot about the person Tara has become. Why was this something you wanted to explore in this novel, and was it deliberate?
Good question. It kind of appeared, I think. I knew that something terrible had happened, and I don't know, it was one of those things that developed organically. I didn't kind of sit there and go, you know what, I'm going to write a domestic violence book, because that's not how I write, for one thing. And I didn't want it to be a story with a kind of a moral or, some kind of, this is educational process. I wanted it to be something that people could immerse themselves in and enjoy, but also engage with and find inspiring, and hopefully also think about, have thoughts about themselves. So, and I think because family violence, because of its nature, it's often quite nuanced, and there are a lot of ethical issues, and there are a lot of issues about how that relationship can pan out, around the violence. So it wasn't something that I set out to do, in answer to your question. It was more something that just popped into my head and started going that way. And that's kind of how I write. My characters work it out in advance, and then I start to learn the story along the way, learn their backstory.
The impact of the events of Tara and Zac's childhoods turned them into people who were polar opposites. It was something I alluded to earlier. Now, Tara was a rule follower. She was careful not to draw attention to herself. She was a very hard worker. And Zac, on the other hand, was a definite rule breaker, and trouble seemed to find him. It's not uncommon for siblings raised in the same house to be so different. But in Tara and Zac's case, I think the things that set them apart seemed greater than the things that held them together. And yet they loved each other fiercely, didn't they?
Yeah, they do. And isn't that just the sibling relationship all over? Sometimes you love them so much that you almost hate them. It's complex thing, sibling relationships, and I wanted to show that. And my experience of siblings is that even when they drive me mad, I love them. So I wanted to show that. And you know, why else would Tara put herself out so much? For a big part of their lives, they've got Nan, but apart from that, they've really only got each other. So they are going to be really closely bonded. And what they went through together as well. And no one else understands. And I think deep down, they both firmly believe that no one else will ever understand. So if you've got that in your past, really, how else could it go other than that you're going to have this connection, even if you do drive each other crazy?
Tara was an angry woman for a long time, and she did much to put distance between herself and her family. And I could feel her anger coming off the page in waves. I wondered if that made her difficult to write from your point of view, and if so, how did you get inside her head?
Do you know, it didn't. I don't know if I've got maybe a whole bunch of anger myself that I just... But I found it quite cathartic to write that. I think there was a lot of anger in me as a teenager. Maybe that's just a teenage thing. When you're someone who doesn't feel that confident in the world socially, I didn't feel like I had a lot of social control in my own teenage years or power. And Tara feels like that. But for a very kind of overt reason. So I was able to just externalize some of the stuff that I had been through. I guess where it got difficult was then making her a little bit more palatable for the reader, because I probably had gone a little too far at the start, and I had to go back and just make her a bit more relatable, because if not everyone is just completely one big ball of anger, although there actually are people out there like that, I suppose. But I needed to have her so that people kind of also liked Tara. And also she has moved on, you know, she's grown up and the anger is not so much there anymore. She's got more understanding. But certainly when she was a teenager, she was really hard work. You know, it was all door slamming and playing loud music and ignoring her nan and not having any friends and not wanting to go to parties or sleepovers and just being really internalized and running to the beach whenever she felt stressed out. So, I really enjoyed writing that. And I kind of had a bit of a Tara soundtrack, which I think Dan mentions because he's quite interested in Tara. He mentions there's a whole Tara soundtrack. So I kind of had that going on my Spotify while I was writing the book.
That's very cool. I can only imagine that.
Lots of 90s feminist grunge.
Alanis Morissette, I can just hear it. Suffice it to say that there was a fair bit of criminal activity bubbling along underneath the surface of this storyline. So I wondered, did you have to do much research to bring these subplots into the narrative?
Yeah, I did have to do a bit of research because I'm not a career criminal myself.
Funny enough.
You know, we've all had experiences with petty crime, but the type of crime that Zac got up to was a bit more than that. And then, of course, we have the bikies. It's kind of an outlaw bikie gang. And there's also a little bit of a subplot with a guerrilla artist kind of doing environmental street art. But what I really needed was a bit of help from a cop. So I did a dial-a-cop kind of thing. I've used police in the past to help me with stuff. I met a policewoman a few years ago at a police station open day. And she then helped me out with one of my books where one of the main characters was a police officer. But for this one, I just put the word out on Facebook and said, hey, does anyone know a cop? I've got a couple of questions. And a friend of mine tagged another friend and said, hey, is Bulldog available? And I was intrigued immediately. And then the friend said yes. So she messaged me and she said, look, my husband, his nickname's Bulldog. He's a sergeant. He's worked in the country, so he might be the right kind of person for you to bounce things off. And he was amazing. You know, I rang him and we just had a chat through some of the things that went on. And I asked him, is this likely? And what would the police do if this happened? And, you know, so he was able to fill in those gaps for me, which is amazing. And one of the things I learned, which was very interesting to me, is that they don't read the Miranda rights in the same way that they do in the US here. So I always just assumed that if you got arrested, because I've never been arrested, they would say, you know, you have the right to remain silent, blah, 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 blah. They don't really do it like that, though. Apparently it's a bit different here. They'll make sure that the prisoner is aware of their rights, but they won't read it out like a little speech like they do in US television. So that caused a bit of editing to be required. And then I was so pleased and grateful for the help that I named one of my policeman characters after Bulldog in the book.
Yeah, fascinating. One of the things that I learned from this, and this is after a career in the law, I guess it's common sense, but I didn't even really think about it, that you can't actually ride in a caravan whilst it's being towed by a car, which I'd never really thought about. You just don't turn your mind to these things. But that was something that I learned in the context of this book, which I found really fascinating, something which preoccupies Tara quite a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So when they're driving along on the new road trip, the current one, there's a point where Zac spots some hitchhikers, and there happen to be a couple of cute young girls, and he's quite keen to pick them up. And Tara's very worried about them. She doesn't like the idea of young women hitchhiking, across, and she's kind of like, haven't they seen Wolf Creek? So she does eventually go, all right, fine, we'll stop. And then they invite them in, and it turns out there's 3 of them, and they don't all fit in the car. And one of them suggests, oh, maybe I could ride in the caravan. And Tara immediately says, absolutely not. And you find out why as the story goes on.
Sasha, tell me about Dan. Now, he's the third wheel, so to speak, of this sibling road trip, and yet in many ways he's the buffer between Tara and Zac. He's essential to helping them reach their destination individually and collectively. So I wondered who or what inspired Dan?
Well, we've all met that kind of Zen person who just seems to have their stuff together, haven't we? And we go, how? And I think with the 2 of them bouncing off each other, Zac and Tara, like they do, Tara's so kind of wound up and tightly reeled, and Zac completely the other way, like completely unreliable and late everywhere. And why don't we just go and have a look at this on the road trip? Dan's sort of like you say, he's the buffer zone, but he's also a kind of a mediator. He can speak both their languages, so he can translate between them. He can see that they both really love each other, so he can also try and express to each one that the other has only got their best interests at heart. He's one of those people that has just learned really early on that a lot of life and what is expected of us is a kind of a script that we're supposed to follow so that we can fit into a neat little patriarchal capitalist society. And he, when he's a young man, decides, okay, I've got the grades, but I don't want to go to university. I want to explore and I want to do things that I'm passionate about and that make me happy. So right from the very early days, he is just following his own script. And Tara can't quite get her head around that because she's been the complete opposite. Zac really admires it because even though that's kind of what he wants to do, he manages to stuff it up a lot. So, Dan's got a really special place in my heart. I have him as this really peaceful presence in the story who asks hard questions occasionally just at the right moment that make either of them think and, try and work out how to get beyond some of the things that are holding them back.
Indeed, he was a beautiful character and I really enjoyed his presence in this book. As I mentioned in my introduction, this road trip took readers on a journey from Perth up to the northwest of WA, much of it along the coast. And some of the towns were plagued by issues caused by mining giants, environmental degradation, impact on marine life, as well as flora and fauna. And I love the way you wove commentary about this into the narrative. So I wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about Cracked and his graffiti art.
So as they're driving along, Tara starts to notice that there are some artworks in the towns that they're visiting. And she kind of starts to realise that this artist, who is known by the name of Zed, or just as Zed, is possibly taking the same journey as them, possibly just before, like they're almost following him or her up the coast. Mm. And she loves the art, like she's really excited about it. It's like you say, it's environmental commentary, but it's also about corporate greed. And without being heavy-handed, it's actually quite humorous art, but it also makes people think. And there's a little bit of a following online. There's some bloggers who are interested in what this artist is doing. And so Tara starts to take photos of the paintings and send them in herself. And I don't want to give spoilers, but it ends up being quite a significant part of the journey. I mean, I love art myself. My partner is an artist and I'm always really interested in art that is social commentary. I love Banksy and that kind of stuff. So, yeah, this sort of popped into the story and became a nice little subplot, I think.
Yeah, it was brilliant. I really enjoyed that. Sasha, I understand that you're an ambassador for Books in Homes charity. Can you tell me a little bit more about this charity and why it's important to you?
So a few years ago, I was asked if I just very last minute could talk on radio about books in homes as an author. And even though I knew very little about it, I jumped in and went, yeah, sure, no worries at all. Did a little bit of homework and worked out that it actually is a charity that I 100% wanted to get behind because it's just beautiful. The idea is that there are certain kids in society who are disadvantaged in the sense that they don't have home libraries. And a home library is actually one of the key success factors for just people living in any country. I was very lucky in that my big sister was a huge reader, so she amassed her own library. Every penny she got, she would spend on books. And, I'm sure she thieved a few from school libraries along the way as well. So I had my own ready-made library there, and I was also a book hoarder and a massive reader. I used to just borrow huge amounts of books and just read. And I feel like that was a big part of my success in life. So to understand that some kids don't actually have any books at home was a bit of a shock to me, to be honest. I was like, how does that even happen? But it does. And a lot of the time these kids come from backgrounds where there might not be a lot of money, or there might be a language barrier, so English is a second language. And what this charity does is it hooks up with schools where there are a lot of kids in that demographic. And they provide funding through corporate sponsorship to put together these little booklets. They're done by Scholastic, and it acts a lot like Scholastic Book Club. So I don't know if you remember the book club when you were a kid at school.
I do, yeah.
I was so jealous of the kids who brought in their money and their little order form and got their books a couple of weeks later. We didn't have enough money for me to do that. But now these kids get to do it, and they get 3 books for free. So that's really cool because they basically get to choose the books. And I think that's where the power is, because a lot of the time there are literacy charities that spray the books out, and they're great quality books, but the kids don't value them because it's not what they would pick up and read. So there are some kids who are like, yeah, this is great, and other kids who are like, yeah, chuck it in the bin, I'm not interested. So these catalogues have a really good range of books that are kind of books about history, books about Minecraft or Fortnite, books about My Little Pony, or more kind of literary children's fiction, picture books, and they get to choose the ones that interest them. And then as a result, the kids actually sit there and read them. And then they get to take them home, they get to share them with their family. The other kids in the family benefit as well. And we've even had stories like a girl who picked out, she was a good reader, and she picked out 2 books that were kind of her reading level, and then she picked out a picture book, and her teacher said, what are you doing? These books, what attracted you to that book? And she said, oh, Christmas is coming and I can't afford to buy my little brother a present, so I thought I'd pick him out a book. So, yeah, isn't that beautiful?
That is beautiful. I love that. Well, such a worthy cause, Sasha. Thank you so much for sharing that on the podcast today.
If people are interested in donating, by the way, just go to, if they look up Books in Homes Australia, and you can donate directly on the website, or we're always looking for corporate sponsors for schools as well.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. I also understand that you write young adult fiction as SD Wasley and children's books as Ash Harrier. I wanted to know, that's incredible. You must be such a busy woman. But I guess on a more practical level, I wondered if you found switching between genres difficult. Do you work on multiple projects at once, or is it more one book at a time, only moving on to the next one when you can focus on that one entirely?
I do prefer to work on one book at a time. And I'm not very tameable when it comes to genre. I love writing different genres, and that must be really annoying for publishers, but it's just who I am and how I write. So luckily I've had the support from publishers where they're quite happy to publish me in different genres, which has been amazing. Yeah, I like to write what I'm working on and then finish that before I go on to the next one. But I'm finding now that I've got my first middle grade series coming out start of August. So that's an adult book now, a children's book August, then a second children's book, because you publish faster in the children's book world, in February, and then my next adult book in next March. So that's quite a lot of books to be having out in just a few months, which means that I'm jumping around between writing, editing, copy edits, proofreads. I can't maintain the luxury of just working on one project at one time anymore, but that's okay. Luckily, it works out pretty nicely. Gives you a little break in between what you're working on and what you should be working on.
Yeah, I guess so. I just find it fascinating, that entire process, and the fact that you can juggle so many projects in a year is just fascinating to me. You must be one incredibly disciplined person.
It's a good thing I love writing. I get to do what I love.
Indeed. Sasha, you might know that there are many writers out there who listen to this podcast, and I wondered, given your publishing experience with both adult novels and children's and young adult novels, if you had any tips for writers out there who are looking to either start writing or get their books published.
Absolutely. I've always got tips. If you're just getting into the world of authoring and you want to be a published author, there's probably 2 tips that I would give. One is that try and get into a bit of a network, because even though in an ideal world, if you wrote an amazing book, it would just get noticed and picked up. In the real world, it's much easier to get your book in front of a publisher if you have contacts in the industry. So start talking to agents and talking to the publishing world, meet other authors and aspiring writers, go to book launches, because then you get to meet published authors, and you do build friendships. I've got friendships among the people who come to my launch events. Go to workshops. That's another great place to network, and conferences. And I guess then to utilize that network, what you want to be doing is just staying in touch and keeping your ear to the ground for opportunities. Yeah, and just don't let things slip you by. So if you're immersed in the writing world, then you see the opportunities, you see deadlines and one day of the year opportunities to send your manuscript in and things like that. So yeah, make sure you join all the newsletters and read the newsletters that come into your inbox. Yeah, really jump into that writing world. And the other tip I would probably have is the one that got me published was I had been flogging a dead horse of a manuscript for about 20 years, just writing, rewriting, sending, getting rejections, getting ignored. And eventually someone gave me the very good advice of, why don't you write something new? And I wrote something new, and that was my first published novel. So if all else fails and you're just not getting anywhere with a manuscript, put it aside for a while or send it off to dozens of publishers and just let it sit and work on something new, because sometimes a manuscript is actually never going to see the light of day, and it was part of your process. It was part of just getting to the point where you can be a published author.
Sasha, if listeners wanted to find out more about you and your books, where can they do that?
Well, the best place would probably be my website. So if they go to sashawasley.com, they will then find links off to my sister site, which is where my paranormal books sit, and they would find information about all my latest releases. They can also follow me on Instagram. That's where I'm most active on socials. I'm not very active on Facebook anymore, and Twitter I'm trying to avoid at the moment pre-election because it's just too stressful. Yeah, so Instagram. They can also look for Ash Harrier, which is the children's books, if they're interested in that, on Instagram.
Sasha, I absolutely loved reading A Caravan Like a Canary, and I highly recommend it to listeners out there looking for a terrific read. I wanted to thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.